Hello, friends, and welcome to the fourth installation of Virtually Live with the Savannah Voice Festival. I'm very excited to be here with all of you and want to welcome you once again to our living room here in New York City, which you saw a couple of nights ago from Maestro Parodi's excellent talk on Don Giovanni. I really want to thank the Savannah Voice Festival, Voice Experience, and our dear friends Cheryl Milnes and Maria Zuvis, who have been like family to us for so many years. Thank you so much for this opportunity and so many other opportunities. Also, a big thank you to Wes and Judy Krulik, names you've already heard this week as enthusiastic longtime supporters of all our work in Savannah, and dear friends to all of us at every juncture. You couldn't ask for better support. Before we get to Puccini, let me remind you to stick around at 6 p.m. for a real treat. Melanie Spector's Soprano Serenade, featuring her singing and playing arias from the operatic soprano repertoire. She's a great talent, and you're in for something very special. And now, on to our composer. Giacomo Puccini was born into a large family of musicians in Lucca, Italy in 1858, one of 9 children. For more than a century, his family had served as organists and composers to the cathedral there, so he was definitely born into an established musical dynasty. His father died when he was only 5 years old, but his mother saw to his education, and at the age of 14, he was the church organist and already writing his first musical compositions. In 1876, when he would have been 18 years old, he and one of his brothers walked 20 miles to Pisa to hear a performance of Verdi's Aida, some 5 years after its premiere. Puccini was so taken by the theatrical work that he became passionate about opera and felt that it would be at the center of his life's work. As you all know, Verdi was considered the most important figure in Italian opera, and some considered Puccini to be his successor in many ways. Before Verdi, opera tended to follow certain formulas of composition, being largely made up of arias, ensembles, duets, and finale sequences at the ends of acts, set pieces. Verdi made advances in these formulas so that there was increasing flexibility in how the pieces were put together, depending on the requirements of the libretto, and he was obviously a man of theater. Asked to compare his own Don Carlo and Aida, Verdi said he preferred Aida because it had more theatricality. How interesting, then, that this was the piece that inspired Puccini so. With Puccini, there was much more of a move toward through-composed pieces, not as much as Wagner, of course, not entirely abandoning numbered arias, but working towards more dramatic continuity. He was also influenced by the Verismo movement in opera, which occurred in the last decade of the 19th century with such composers as Mascagni, Leoncavallo, Cilea, and Giordano. These composers sought to portray more ordinary characters and everyday emotions, usually in a gritty, explosive way. More like a 19th century version of Law and Order, more than Lord of the Rings that had come before that. In the choice of these kinds of characters, you can see that Puccini is closely aligned with that camp, but in other ways, he defies easy characterization with those composers. This Verismo realism movement in opera only lasted for a decade or so before it died out, and though some people put Puccini in this camp, it's probably most accurate to look at some of his pieces as being veristic. Tosca seems to be the obvious example. As I alluded to before, Puccini was deeply interested in drama and the inspiration of the libretto, and as such, he worked very closely with his librettists, Luigi Illica and Giuseppe Giacosa, on all 3 of the operas we are talking about today. Illica was particularly inspired and clever in turning a story into a great plot, but he was passionate and tempestuous. Giacosa was expert in polishing the verse of the libretto. The great Rosa Poncel said about Puccini, "With Puccini, it's drama, drama, drama." And Puccini, for his own part, said he simply couldn't work if the libretto didn't inspire him. His first Turandot, Rosa Raisa, said that the essence of Giacomo Puccini was drama accompanied by music. Puccini's characters face problems that audiences are empathetic to and can relate to, in contrast to some of the elevated historical characters of some earlier composers. They can relate to the creative young men in La Boheme, and they can sympathize with the trusting, naive title character of Madame Butterfly. Though he was accused of too much sentimentality by some critics and other composers throughout the 20th century, he wrote to a friend, "Almighty God touched me with his little finger and said, 'Write for the theater, mind only for the theater,' and I have obeyed his supreme command." With the inspiration of the libretto, Puccini was driven to explore verisimilitude to best portray historic accuracy and psychological believability. After some early efforts, Edgar, Lovili, and the success of Manon Lescaut, Puccini achieved great heights with the three pieces that we're looking at today. Bohème, Tosca, and Butterfly were created between 1896 and 1904, and all three today rank in the top 10 of most performed operas worldwide, according to opera-based statistics. Only Puccini and Mozart regularly have three operas in the top 10. Verdi has one, Aida, no surprise. For the January premiere in 1900 of Tosca at what is now the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma, the composer sought to accurately portray the specific Te Deum melody from the Roman liturgy, as opposed to some other Italian chant melody, and went to great pains to procure it from a friar he had met on a trip to Rome. Here it is. Tu et te gloriosus apostolorum chorus. One more time. Tu et te gloriosus apostolorum chorus. Using this melodic material, Puccini used his characteristic rich orchestration, variety of texture with the scarpia, pipe organ, and chorus to flesh this out, and to create the majesty that concludes the first act. Though we aren't able to have visuals today, please enjoy our magnificent friend Cheryl Milnes under the baton of Zubin Mehta with the New Philharmonia Orchestra. Now here it is. Puccini became interested in Madama Butterfly the same year as that Tosca when he attended a performance in London of the play based on John Luther Long's short story, Madame Butterfly. Though he didn't understand the English language of the play, he was taken in by the obvious pathos of the dramatic situation. The premiere of Madame Butterfly took place in February of 1904 in La Scala, and for this, Puccini went well beyond the typical composer fascination with exoticism and Orientalism. He sent Illica to Nagasaki to investigate the local flavor, and he himself researched Japanese music, even learning folk songs from the wife of the Japanese ambassador to Italy. This tune, Ichigo Jishi, or the Ichigo Lion Dance, was written by a kabuki composer in 1811 and became a favorite of Puccini's. He was especially taken by the jagged way the melody jumps up to F sharp towards the end. So here's the Ichigo Jishi. Here's going up. So that's the Ichigo Jishi. Transformed by Puccini, it became Goro's music right after Pinkerton's aria in the first act, at which he points out the approaching Madama Butterfly for her first entrance. Right after this aria. Thanks to Piero de Palma as Goro, with Eric Leinsdorf conducting the RCA Italiana Opera Orchestra. One of the things that contributes the most to our enjoyment of Puccini is the expertise with which he portrays the psychology of the characters. In La Bohème, premiered in 1896, and the first of our three operas that we are discussing today, Puccini found a story that was more a portrait of emotional characters and less a linear narrative. Here he uses fidgety rhythms, well-placed silences, and an overall halting feeling to give the sense of a first-time meeting between Mimi and Rodolfo, two people who don't yet know one another. Si sente meglio, sì, qui c'è tanto freddo, sega vicino al fuoco, aspetti un po' di vino, grazie, a lei poco poco, così, grazie. Che bella bambina, ora permette che accenda il lume, è tutto passato, tanta fretta, sì. Silence and tune. Okay? Now, returning to Tosca, Puccini uses drastically different music to show us the change in our heroine's fortunes. Passionate and mercurial when she makes her first appearance on stage in Act 1, her vocal writing is almost like recitative. This is Leontine Price as Tosca on the same recording we've already heard. Placido Domingo is our Cavaradossi. So this is our tempo. Notice how she goes much faster than the basic beat. Thank you. Later, when she's completely desperate at the end of her rope, Tosca is at the other end of the rhythmic spectrum. The quick interjections have given way to something that sounds sapped of energy, like her character at this moment. As Tosca, you will hear Maria Yeritza, Puccini's favorite Tosca, who said that he told her, "Carissima mia, you have to walk on clouds of melody." Gorgeous, isn't it? To look a bit further at ways Puccini was able to vary his portrayal of the personalities and psychological situations of his characters, let's have a look at the three principal tenors of the operas and the tools Puccini uses to make us empathize with what he called these little souls. Ardent and passionate at the beginning, the painter Cavaradossi in Tosca sings of his passionate lover of that name. We easily understand his confidence and extroversion as he moves higher in range on the second page. So from the beginning, recondita armonia di bellezze diverse e bruna floria l'ardente amante mia. Now the melodic line moves up. E te beltà ignota, cinta di chiome bionde. By contrast, the poet Rodolfo in Bohème starts hesitantly, almost with wonderment, as he clasps Mimi's cold hand. Notice the low, non-threatening tessitura and the way the notes don't change in the melody at first. Che gelida manina se la lasci riscaldar, cercar che giova al buio non si trova. Then, as Rodolfo starts to explain to Mimi that he's a poet and talks more about himself, it starts to open up a little more confidently. Chi son? Chi son? Sono un poeta. Che cosa faccio? Scrivo. E come vivo? Vivo. Finally, as he completely opens up emotionally, we get the full investment of Puccini's melodic gift, and you can understand why this is one of his most beloved arias. Conducted by Arturo Toscanini, the conductor of the premiere of this opera, by the way, this is Jan Peerce with the NBC Symphony Orchestra. In there, you can hear a bit of the contribution of Toscanini singing along with Peerce. Our third tenor, Pinkerton, in Madama Butterfly, is the one of the three that's the bad guy in the opera, at least in the traditional sense. Puccini specifically sought to use bluff, straightforward music for the American characters in this opera to contrast with the Japanese-sounding colors. As Pinkerton sings his first aria, the text, everywhere in the world the Yankee vagabond enjoys and busies himself, ignoring the risks. He's calling him an ugly American. His melodic writing is more jagged, fewer softening stepwise intervals, and more instrumental writing like a trumpet. You can hear the obvious Star-Spangled Banner quote at the beginning of this bit. Dovunque al mondo lo Yankee vagabondo si gode, traffica, sprezzando I rischi. Now, I know that we already had a couple of questions ahead of time, And one of them was about what makes Puccini so musically quotable. In my opinion, it's exactly this gift for beautiful, psychologically apt melodies that make one walk out of a Puccini opera easily singing the tunes. Not only are they engaging tunes by any criteria, they're also connected to characters that we have an emotional connection to. Hearing these tunes in the service of something that we feel emotionally connected to helps to imprint them on the brain. Other operas that are less dependent on melodic rewards, but that are maybe extremely psychologically gripping or extra rhythmically engaging, can certainly be really enjoyable, but it may not be as easy to quote when you leave the theater. Think maybe the operas of Britten, Adams, Berlioz, for example. Another question. Was Puccini really not taken as seriously in his time as a classical composer? And did he enjoy public success during his time? He was taken seriously, yes, of course, but like all composers, he was criticized by some more than others. Some accused him of being too sentimental, others said he was insufficiently intellectually curious, he didn't have enough interest in politics, he wasn't musically sophisticated, he paid insufficient attention to form, etc., etc. But the fact remains that his operas were extremely successful and popular. Though Butterfly had a particularly controversial premiere with booing and chaos, probably orchestrated by rivals, it was by far the exception. And in fact, it's probably the very popularity that he did enjoy that contributed to making his contemporaries jealous. One way in which he was actually rather surprisingly musically interesting was his wide use of leitmotif. Of course, we know this term mostly in connection to the works of Wagner, but Puccini used it as well to associate themes with particular characters or ideas in his works. Unlike Wagner, he didn't transform the motifs or modify them as building blocks, but they served as markers for certain characters and made certain associations more clear. A very good example is the Scarpia motif from Tosca. Based on a tritone, the diabolical interval in music history, augmented fourth or diminished fifth. It's inherently unsettled and dissonant. It's the first motive that we hear in the opera. So the bass covers this tritone, and the harmony is later in the first act, when the sacristan and the children are celebrating the news of Napoleon's apparent defeat, the motive leaves little doubt as to who has ended the celebration. And as you all know, that's our great Cheryl Milne's Scarpia in the recording that we already heard before. And with that, I hope I've whetted your appetite to hear some Puccini in the very, very near future, but not before you stick around to hear the wonderful Melanie Spector's Soprano Serenade at 6 o'clock. Once again, I would really like to thank Judy and Wes Krulik, the Savannah Voice Festival, Voice Experience, and especially Maria Zuvis and Cheryl Milnes. Everyone stay safe and healthy. Please stay inside. Please wear your masks. And I can't wait to see you live in Savannah soon. Take care.